Kathy led a conversation. Is she coming? No.
I don't know.
No. So this is Susan Halford, who is one of the...
We've met last week.
Of course. We've launched ourselves as a W3C node. We've had some great talks about the state of the web, and it's a bit scary. But where's David? Is he here? Where's he gone? David Rogers. The scary things about what's happening with the... We are actually looking at the fragmentation, balkanisation of the internet. It's really very scary. And so our work is not done. This is just starting. And the... no, you don't sit on my cake, and that's my chair. That's my chair. Anyway.
Don't sit on my cake.
My tea. I haven't had a cup of tea all day. For those on the live stream. Every time I try and get near food or drink, someone wants to talk to me.
I'll sit on your cake.
So, we come now to someone who so empathises with her work, with what we are doing with web science. I've got the wonderful Jeanette Hofmann, who I had the privilege to meet. I knew of her, but I had the privilege to meet and hear her talk at the web conference in Florence. Ooh, well over a year ago, yeah, 2015. She amazed the conference, and I thought, God, she's talking about the sort of stuff that we love, the whole co-construction, co-creation, the socio-technical. And she lives and breathes what we do. She's honorary professor of internet politics at, it's got a very long title, University in Berlin. She's head of the policy project group of the internet policy field. And since, this is how she first came to my attention, I'm sure my colleagues in social science knew of her long before this. In April 2012, she became director of the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society, which is how I first came across her name and the amazing work she does. And I want to just say thank you so much for coming. I've been looking forward to this since we met in Florence, and Jeanette will now tell you more about herself and give us her thoughts on democracy in the digital age, which is such a topic at the moment. Jeanette.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. When Wendy wrote to me and asked whether I would come, I decided, yes, I want to do something new, something I haven't talked about yet. And then it became pretty soon pretty stressful, because it's not so easy to do something what you haven't done before. And the title already has been tuned down. In the beginning was more the title and abstract I sent was a bit more ambitious than what I'm going to deliver now. It is very much work in progress, but I've decided this will be a topic I'm dealing with for the coming years. I really want to work on that relationship, internet and democracy. I'm of course not the first one who sort of thinks about that. Actually, going back to the 1990s, we saw a lot of texts writing about that relationship. One of the most prominent one is probably John Henry Barlow with his independence, the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. At that time, there were still sort of great hopes that with the internet we would get the opportunity to do something politically radical, new and different from what we have. Also expectations we had to tune down over time. Most of the contributions we've seen since that who deal with internet and democracy, they tend to treat the internet as a tool for existing forms of democracy, say increasing participation, more transparency, changing power balances, but it's always the internet as a tool for practices and institutions of democracy that are well established. But we know very little about how democracy as a regime of authority itself changes through its interaction with the internet? Could it be that democracy itself has to be thought of in different terms? This is what I'm thinking about and what I want to talk about it today. There is, in fact, one outstanding example, an author who addressed this relationship of media and democracy in those terms. And this is Benedict Anderson. He wrote in the 1980s a book about the relationship between what he called imagined communities and the emergence of newspapers. The story he tells goes about like this. There is print capitalism emerging after the printing press was invented, sort of capital going into the newspaper business in the 17th, 18th century. And for this sort of new industry to strive, they needed bigger language communities than those that existed at this time. In the very early modernity, people still used Latin script as the written language, and that excluded sort of the most of the people being around at that time. And newspapers needed bigger language communities to sell newspapers. So it's not that they created these language communities, but they certainly provided incentives for people to communicate and read in the same languages. So what we see in the 17th, 18th centuries is print languages emerging, what Anderson calls mass vernacular literacy. People begin to write and read in the same languages across larger geographic distances. And this again creates at that time the possibility of what he calls a unified field of communication in various countries along those lines. And this, again, creates the possibility for what he calls new forms of imagined communities. He called them imagined because people didn't know each other anymore. They had shared something, they regarded themselves as a community because they spoke the same language and could communicate about issues of common concerns. So that is what he calls the nation, an imagined community created ultimately by same language that again was sort of pushed or driven by newspapers and journalism. So this kind of story about how media make possible the development of the demos, who then claims the right to self-determination. This is a story that Anderson wrote about 200-300 years after it happened. Of course, right now we cannot write a similar story about how the internet changes democracy. It's sort of something that happens at present. We cannot tell such a story, but we can still ask. We can ask how the internet changes our democratic practices and how it might change our understanding of democracy. And this is what I have been thinking about, actually have been pretty obsessed with over the last months. And I will now use a practical example to illustrate what I mean. This example, many people will probably have heard about it. It's the story about Facebook curating content and deleting a famous picture. What happened is this. There is this Norwegian journalist, Tom Egeland, who uploads on his Facebook timeline a couple of war pictures that he thought are changing our understanding, as sort of the international community of people. It changes our understanding of wars. And then Facebook deletes this picture. Not the other ones, but it deleted this picture. different than, I mean, unlike other people to whom this had happened before. It was not the first time that this picture was uploaded to Facebook, but unlike the others, he protested against it. He first, I should say, Facebook sent him a message saying, you cannot show this picture on Facebook because it shows nudity. Nudity is not permitted according to our community standards. So we take it down, and here's a warning. Should you do this again, you will be banned for a certain time from posting to Facebook. Egeland then contacts the woman who is seen on this picture and tells her about what Facebook did. The woman again finds this was very upset about this, and she talked to a Norwegian news agency about it, and then subsequently there were articles in the Norwegian press about it. Egeland uploads the picture of this woman against the background of this picture and uploads it on his Facebook site and gets banned. He got a 24 hours ban, couldn't post anymore. Now, the next thing that happens is that the Norwegian newspapers Aftenposten gets involved. The editor-in-chief of that newspaper found that really incredible, wrote an article about Facebook censoring this picture, and posts the article with a picture of the Vietnam War picture on its Facebook site, so that the picture reappears on Facebook. Facebook then sends a message to the Norwegian newspaper telling the Norwegian newspaper that it cannot post this picture, and even before Aftenposten, the Norwegian newspaper, had time to take it down, Facebook deleted it. And now we have an even more powerful voice, that is the editor-in-chief of Aftenposten, Espen Egil Hansen. He got very upset himself and wrote a public letter to Mark Zuckerberg. Dear Mark, he wrote, and that then really sort of circulated around the world. He wrote a letter and he recorded the video where he said basically the same thing, namely how upset and how disappointed he is about the behavior of Facebook. And he also makes this point that what Facebook is doing here threatens, undermines what he calls a mainstay of our democratic society. It's a very passionate letter, and it emphasizes the strong link between the role of newspapers and democracy. He says that newspapers have the role to raise issues to the general public, even things that the public doesn't like. He talks about unpleasant truths that need to be brought to the attention to the people. And he says it is sort of the responsibility, the skill, and also the experience of human editors to decide what should be published and what should not be published. And he then sort of juxtaposes the skill, the experience, responsibility of the newspaper editor to that of an algorithm designed in California. And he does this, of course, on purpose to say we as newspapers, as skilled journalists, still have a job, a task here that an algorithm cannot fulfill. So that is the story he tells. And here we see a first dimension of how democracy plays a role in this story. But it doesn't stop here. If we dig a bit deeper and look at the picture itself, we see other, perhaps even more important qualities of democracy that I want to talk about now. What we see in this debate between Hansen and Facebook or Zuckerberg is actually two different rationalities. From Facebook's point of view, what we see on that Vietnam War picture is, or what the sort of selecting algorithm actually detects, is indeed naked skin and naked skin of a child. Facebook's community standards clearly outrule nudity. So from this perspective, Facebook did exactly what it announced it would do if people try to show naked bodies. For Hansen, in turn, this is not about a naked child. It is an iconic war picture that belongs, as the Norwegian Prime Minister, who also got involved in this discussion, said what Facebook does here is it edits human history, our common human history. So it's not about a naked body, it is about warnings about the horror of war. Now, Hansen thinks he is correct in his interpretation. And after all, he won this debate. Facebook allowed him to update that picture. He thinks he is right in his interpretation. I would stress, on the other hand, that the meaning is not in this picture. It is not part of that picture. And there is none of them strictly right about it. Rather, this picture is open to different interpretations. It allows various meanings. And this debate occurred between the two because these meanings need to be discussed and negotiated. So what I see here are two different rationalities that both are justified in a way. If we look at what Facebook does, it wants to create what it calls a secure environment for Facebook users. Why is this actually an issue, this secure environment? It is because user-generated content over time has become a risk. Millions and millions of people are uploading their stuff, and some of it is pretty distasteful. Remember all the debates about hate speech that we've had over the last years. There is a lot of content one would rather not want to see and not be posted on Facebook. So because there is so much of that content, at least, I mean, we have 1.7 billion of active users per month who upload per minute 136,000 pictures. There is no way that Facebook ever could sort of employ a human editor who looks at all the pictures and makes this sort of sound judgment about whether they should be shown to the world or not. With a social network of that size, there is no other way than using algorithms to implement their own standards. Of course, one can still discuss whether the final decision should be made by algorithms, but it is clear that networks of this size cannot be managed by human editors anymore. But that is only one of the issues Facebook is dealing with. The other big issue is that the bigger they become, the more conflicting the expectations are that Facebook has to deal with. Over the first years of Facebook's existence, they were always confronted with criticism of censorship, but over the last 2 or 3 years, we see more and more debates about Facebook not doing enough about hate speech being removed from the website. In nearly every country, they get requests from governments to do something about their content. So for them, they have to sort of learn to manage user-generated content in a way that does not risk their business model. And they use their terms of service and what they call community standards as a source of legitimacy for the way they handle this. Now, Aftenposten looks at this picture and this conflict from a completely different perspective. For them, the newspaper is in the tradition of creating a democratic public that is able to manage its own affairs. For them, it is about creating controversies about political matters that are really important for the people they serve. And for them, it's sort of the experienced editor who is proud of his experience, of his education as a journalist, who sort of judges what we should see. And for them, the source of legitimacy of what they do is freedom of speech as a human right. That is sort of what legitimizes Aftenposten's and other newspapers' action. Now, what I find important about these different rationalities is that the ambiguity we see in this picture and in the algorithms that do the pre-selection is that we can generalize that. It's not only about this picture. We will see the same kind of ambiguity in lots of pictures, objects, and technologies. What I want to say here is that they always need negotiation. They are open because they are sort of don't carry their message in themselves. It's about the context that we use when we look at such a picture and judge its quality. It's our judgment and our context that make us look at such a picture. So we need to negotiate the meaning of the picture because the meaning is not in the picture itself. And in case of this Facebook, this most recent Facebook conflict, we could see that within this few weeks, more and more important people got involved who then again called on other people to make their point. Sort of, it was an international global negotiation over the meaning of this picture. And I would say that these kind of negotiations we see on the internet and off the internet all the time. And the important point here is that when we discuss technology, the assumption is that the meaning, the purpose, the use of technology, as in this case in these algorithms, is not in the technology itself, but it is always ascribed to that object that we discuss about. So in sociology of technology, we call this interpretive flexibility, meaning that technical objects are always open to reinterpretation. This is a term, interpretive flexibility, that was coined, I think, by Trevor Pinch and Biker in 1984. So they wrote an article about the invention of the bicycle. There are lots of funny pictures of that bicycle article on the internet, where the sort of the meaning, the shape, the design, but also the sort of group of users of bicycles is discussed over a long time, and that sort of has a real impact on the design of the bicycle. So the counter-narrative that this idea of interpretive flexibility tells is that the meaning and functionality of technology is not self-evident. Technology development does not follow its own logic, and therefore it is not something that is categorically different from other social activities. It's just part of society. And this is what this idea of interpretive flexibility means. Like any other social activity, it is open to our interpretation. There are, in the history of technical infrastructures, lots of examples for this kind of interpretive flexibility. And the one I'm using to make my point is, surprise, surprise, the internet itself. Dave Clark, one of the pioneers of internet technology. He published an article earlier this year called The Contingent Internet. I was quite surprised about the title of this article, because I always thought contingency, that is a term used in the social sciences, but not so much in computer science. And I did indeed ask some computer scientists whether they knew that term and would ever actively use it. And from what I heard, no, it's not used. If it's used, then say in the context of a contingency plan. That is a word that is of common use. But contingency as a concept is rather foreign to the engineering sciences. So contingency, as social scientists understand it, actually refers to the non-necessity of all things existing. That's what Wikipedia has to say about contingency. The non-necessity. We could imagine that they would have never been developed. And this is actually the question that Dave Clark's article starts with. Could we imagine that the internet would have never been developed? And the answer he gives in the first paragraphs is, generally, the idea of data networks was pretty much around at that time. There were many people thinking about connecting these big computers and sort of using networks for transferring data. But, and that is this important point, we could have imagined very different networks than the internet. There were so many different ideas of how a network should be designed. And that is what he probably means by contingency. He doesn't really discuss that term. There could have been very different internets, and the people who of you who know about the history of the internet also know about what Dave Clark calls forks in the road. And he mentions in his article quite a few. I've listed here a few. First of all, the idea of general purpose versus known purpose networks. As you know, a telephone network is a known purpose network, whereas the internet got its idea from the computer, which is a sort of all-purpose machine. And the internet was designed without optimizing it for any use. This was a very big discussion around the time the internet was developed. Should it sort of be optimized for certain uses, or should it not be used? And of course, there are always trade-offs. And he mentions quite a few in this article. If you design a general purpose network, specific applications might be harder to implement than when you create a network specifically designed for these applications. Then a second one concerns open platform versus provider-defined services. The sort of term that we use today to discuss this is network neutrality. That is still not solved. Then datagram versus virtual circuit networks, and for newer forks in the road that haven't been solved yet is encryption versus state-controlled networks. That is a battle going on right now. And another one he mentions that will accompany us for a long time concerns the question of how we will pay for the internet in future. Do we want to keep paying with our personal data, or do we come up with a better solution to this problem? So these are what he calls forks in the road, and the internet could have taken completely different paths than it has, and that shows how open technology development is for different developments, but also for different meanings that we assign to these technologies. For him, for Dave Clark, this is about struggles over control between engineers, business models, or that is a point he makes, he emphasizes very much, choice of users. According to Dave Clark, users have had a tremendous impact on the development of the internet. Email is an example. Used to be the most popular application on the internet. Perhaps it will die out at some point, who knows. But it was the first really popular application, and those who designed it never thought of that. It was users who pushed the development in this direction. So his point is that users should have an impact on the development of the internet, and that is clearly a non-technical, non-engineering based force that he values very high. So one could say that debates such as those mentioned by Dave Clark about the development of the internet, they push the development of technology in a certain direction, but they also make visible what he calls forks in the road. It's because of debates that we get an idea of the choice that we have. And choice, sort of various options to choose from, is such an important element of democracy. Self-determination makes only sense in environments where there is something to decide. We have in political science an equivalent to the idea of contingency or interpretive flexibility, and that is called politicization. Politicization makes exactly this point. There are many definitions of politicization. I like the one by a British political scientist called Colin Hay, who defined politicization in actually quite simple terms by saying issues are politicized when they become the subject of deliberation, decision-making, and human agency where previously they were not. Because this is such a simple and general definition, it applies to what we would conventionally call political matters as much as to things that are usually seen as outside of democratic decision-making, and that is technology development. So when Vint Cerf and others developed TCP/IP, they politicized, in a way, network design, because at that time when TCP/IP was developed, telecommunication engineers had a very good idea of what a network is about and what are sort of criteria of quality that should be respected when building a new network. And with TCP/IP, there is suddenly choice. There is a need for debate because a competing design of engineering pops up that sort of promotes completely different criteria of network design. So choice, as Colin Hay defines it, is not choice in the way economists would define it. For economists, choice is about preferences within a framework of given options. For Hay, choice is a much more basic thing. It is an antonym of fate and necessity. So there is choice or no choice. And when engineers tell you this is the optimal solution and there is no other one, then this is a way of depoliticizing an issue, of sort of excluding choice. Choice occurs when we becoming aware of what Colin Hay calls the capacity for things to be different. I think this is really a beautiful formulation, the capacity for things to be different. And that kind of capacity, of course, is not the same with every object. When you, for example, think of the law of gravity, there might not be that much capacity for being different around. But there is always a range, right? There is sort of this interpretive flexibility of things, can be very narrow or it can be very broad. but only public debate is sort of able to make that range visible and to bring it home to us, whether we have a choice, and sort of how many various options there might be. So Colin Hay has tried to work on this a bit. He worked on this a bit more and distinguishes between processes and degrees of politicization. It's not a super good copy. It's from my book, and I couldn't find it anymore now. It's slightly crappy pictures of it. But yeah, I've lost the book. It's somewhere at home or in my office. Couldn't find it. Whatever. The main point is you have here the realm of necessity and fate. That could, for example, be stuff that is considered God-given. My favorite example for realm of necessity is the debate about climate change. There are so many people who think it's not human-made, it's just there. It's sort of nature itself, and sometimes the earth gets warmer and sometimes it gets cooler. But this debate sort of moves the issue of climate change around between the realm of necessity and the other spheres that you see here, the private sphere, the public sphere, and the governmental sphere. So public debates, what they do, they move issues between what Colin Hay here describes as various spheres. And when we go back to our example about the Facebook pictures, what the public debate managed to do is move an issue of private concern. It concerns, after all, Facebook's own standards, content policies. It moved a private issue from the private sphere into the public sphere. So politicization can move things into different spheres, and it does so on the internet quite often. That will be one of my points I make towards the end, that the debates we see on the internet is moving issues from the private sphere, and I would say that technology development is one of the big areas that are usually regarded as private, in the sense of it's either companies or private standard setting bodies who are responsible here, and the rest of the world can then be grateful for the miracles that come out of this private sphere. So public debates can move things into the public sphere, and that's what we call politicization. But what also can happen is that things move from the governmental or public sphere out into the private sphere, and that is what we call depoliticization. It is a very dynamic process, and things move around all the time. But it's useful to look at this, to sort of use this image, because with these various spheres, we have different sort of power of influencing them, or sort of appropriating them for societal decisions. When things are considered fate or as necessary, then we have no impact on them, or we don't claim any impact. So when you think of public debates on issues, you'll see that things move around all the time. So in the case of Facebook, what is their private right to set their content policy became a public issue, and they had to justify themselves. They couldn't just point to their terms of service and say, sorry folks, that's our decision. They had to justify it. They had to explain to everybody why they did it, and then they had to back off and change their rule. So this is quite a victory, and we've seen a lot of them recently. I will show you what I mean. This is the note that Facebook sent to Aftenposten when they asked them to take down the picture. And what is quite surprising about this note is how very detailed the rules have become that Facebook applies to its content. Photos of women actively engaged in breastfeeding or exposing reconstructed nipples for awareness are allowed. We also make allowances for digitally produced content posted for educational, humorous, or satirical purposes. Each of these sub clauses represent a debate that has taken place at some point. The one about women breastfeeding I remember, because it was also one of these debates that made it into European newspapers. So we have debates and they leave a dent in the private realm of Facebook and other social networks making policies. But before we become too pleased with the sort of traces that public debates leave, one thing seems pretty obvious. Since we know that this Vietnam War picture had been taken several times before, it needs a powerful voice. In this case, it needed the Norwegian Prime Minister and it needed a editor-in-chief of a large newspaper to actually achieve this. Not everybody will have that kind of impact. And secondly, one can of course ask whether a change of these rules are really worth the fuss. Is that what democracy should be about? That we are able to change the terms of service of huge networks that control so much of the public sphere. So I'm not so sure about this myself. I start observing this and don't know really what to think about it. But here are my sort of preliminary conclusions. I think what we can see is indeed new forms of democratic engagement emerging on the internet. First of all, what we see is that the internet itself becomes subject of public debate. We are addressing the future design, the development, the use of a technical infrastructure that means a lot of us. Second, what we see is what one could call ad hoc issue publics emerging around issues. They come up, they sort of make their point and they fall apart again. That is a different kind of public than what Benedict Anderson described in his imagined communities, which were stable over time and above all very national. They worked on a sort of specific territory. Then another thing that I noticed is that the actor constellations are permanently changing. We see, for example, civil society and private companies gathering against the sort of spying of governments. Or we see them fighting governments' attempts to sort of build in backdoors of encryption. Or we see civil society arguing against the internet industry. But we also see the internet industry collaborating with governments against their users. So all sorts of constellations are forming, falling apart again, and changing. Another interesting thing is because theory of democracy always denied the possibility. We are seeing here transnational publics emerging. This Facebook thing did indeed go around the whole world. It was reported in nearly every country. So we create attention for certain issues in a very transnational way, a way that was not possible before we got the internet. And then in terms of substance, what I find quite interesting is that we see attempts to extend human rights to the private sector. As you may know, human rights are usually rights that citizens claim against their government. Governments are responsible for protecting us and for respecting human rights towards their citizens. But the more powerful social networks become, the more it is an issue how they treat, how they balance, how they implement human rights. And many of the debates we've seen on the internet, they address exactly that question. How do private companies that structure the public sphere, how do they deal, how they balance, how they respect, to what degree do they balance human rights? So this amounts to, I think, a blurring lines between public and private sphere, because so many private rule setting is addressed in these public debates, and we see a blurring between social, political and technical issues. In many of these discussions that we see over the last years, for example, about the operation of algorithms, there is no respect anymore for sort of technical competence as something that should be outside of societal influence. We see also in social sciences more and more people engaging at what they call algorithm criticism. I know that computer scientists often don't like that, but still.
Well, yes. Yeah, but it's so important.
There are skills emerging, and people publish paper about it. So technology development as such becomes a subject area dealt with in public debates, and thereby becoming politicized. So, and these are my concluding remarks. What we see is new democratic practices and understandings emerging that seem to complement our traditional representative procedures. So it's not only about voting and sort of talk to your member of the parliament. There are new practices emerging. The overarching goal that I see, it's driven, this kind of practices, by the goal to prevent abuse of power. This is the sort of perhaps smallest common denominator that we see, that we want big companies to respect our interests and our rights and not abuse their power, their factual power. Lots of these practices take the form of intervention and veto, meaning they are not driven by a sort of grand political vision of the future of digital democracy. They are rather modest in their objectives. They want to prevent abuse. So one could call that as a sort of very liberal approach to democracy. It's not this Republican thing of we create a global community, a global demos with common goals. It's rather modest in the sense of let's prevent the internet from going down the drain. So when that's at least my observations at the moment. When we compare that to Benedict Anderson's observation about the impact of the newspaper on democracy, this might look a bit disappointing. So, and is it really disappointing when we leave sort of impacts on the terms of service of Facebook? I think not necessarily so. If we manage to politicize technology development, sort of development of technologies that so much structure our life in common nowadays, then I think democracy really expands its reach in a very relevant way. And I think when this sort of approaches manage to ignore what we would call usually private contract autonomy, sort of a sphere that is only governed by private decision making, then we reclaim a sphere that traditionally is outside of democratic reach. So I'm not too pessimistic. I do see that many people right now think in line with what Hansen said to Facebook, you undermine our democracy. that might be the case, but at the same time, we seem to expand its reach and thereby claim new spheres where we can make our will known to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeanette. Lots of lovely tweeting going on. You'll see them later. And thank you for preparing something new for us. It's very relevant. Right, discussion, questions. Les, and then
So your opening slides
Susan,
about the imagined community and the roles of newspapers, I couldn't help reflect that Facebook is very much an imagined community, but the imagination is really imposed by Zuckerberg, by the terms of contract, by Silicon Valley, by the kind of the neoliberal we need growth, 1.5 billion people. No one starts off thinking we're going to have a social network of 1.5 billion people. How would that work? We'll just advertise them. But this imagination and the enormous imagined social what Facebook represents. How do you see that? How do you respond to that? I mean, yes, we'll just stop there.
I think that's a good point. Is the Facebook imagined community comparable to the newspaper community? I don't think it is. I do think that you, as British people, at least assume to have more in common than the Facebook community, which doesn't even. It's so fragmented in smaller community that I don't think they share. They are sort of connected in the same way as the people are with their national media.
But the narrative about a social network and what that means, because it comes on a technology and we accept it, yes, we're all part of this single social network. Does that add power to it, or do you think that's just...
I think for Facebook itself, it's a double-edged sword. They cannot be sure that this is a community that is loyal to them. They might also turn against it, like the breastfeeding example. There are moments where the people turn against Facebook's rule. And it's, I assume, for Facebook very much a sort of balancing act.
Okay, I've got, one. The chap on the back with glasses, Susan.
So thank you very much for a really interesting talk. There's lots of things that I personally am interested in. My name's Nick Fair, I'm in the websites department here. My interest in education, but I have a private interest, if you like, or maybe it's public, in the political elements of this, of democracy. And I wondered if I'm putting an idea out here just as a thought to get your views. Do you think that interacting with the web, regardless of what you actually do, because the web is based on a set of sort of principles and protocols which embody which you might be able to draw parallels with a particular political position. So in other words, it's fairly non-hierarchical and always been. Do you see that as perhaps the biggest effect on democracy, is that the web is actually challenging the idea of the social contract and promoting the idea of the mutual compact? And this is creating a tension between how people are living on the web and how people are being made to live in society. And that is creating the difficulties with democracy, if you like, or the changes around our ideas of democracy.
I like this question, and I'm say a very determined no.
Why?
Because my whole point was that the internet is something that is open to reinterpretation. It's I didn't use that slide, but I had a slide where I said, democracy, please, what is this? It's like sort of defining it, it's like sort of nailing a jello to the wall. And with the internet, it's a bit similar, right? It's always it's moving around, it's changing very much. And the point is that it could have been different, and it is different for different people. If you see these sort of new fantasies about optimizing it with all sorts of overlay technology, it will, I don't think you could say that it's so consistent in what it is that it could have an impact. In social sciences, we call this technological determinism, to think that there is this internet that has sort of a clear impact on something. No, I think, and that's why my question was about experiencing and using the internet. That, I think, is the way we use it, the way we interact with it, that opens new possibilities.
And drive it. Now I've got, we have to take them in order, Dave, so there's
My question's been answered, thank you.
has it? Okay, so I'm going to go around in order. Dave, you're on the list. Susan, and then Henry, and then I'll go to Dave. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed that, and I really like your conceptualisation of this idea of the dents that the various forms of activity might make in the policies and practices of these big web actors. I also like the moderation that you made of that. Clearly, we're not all the editor of Huffington Post, and we're not all the king of Norway. My question is, given that, and given that I really like that, is there anything that we can do to promote that kind of denting activity? Or do we just sort of leave it? Is it all just open to chance, given those deeper power structures that you're talking about, that then starts to seem slightly less optimistic than I want to be?
For me, fully. I think about that often, and I'm not sure myself. What I can say, for me, it always starts with sort of thinking in alternatives. That is, for me, sort of the basic democratic act that particularly academics, it's sort of, for me, their duty to think in alternatives. What are the different ways we can go forward, and what are the different ways interpreting what we are doing right now? And what are sort of the implications of the various options that we have? For me, this is where it starts. And if we communicate that with others, that is, for me, our contribution. Sort of not accepting something as fate.
I didn't quite follow all that, so you have yes. Henry, you were next.
So if you're thinking about alternatives, the logic of alternatives is known as modal logic.
How's it called?
Modal logic.
Modal logic.
So the logic of possibilities
Yeah.
and of course
Yeah,
contingency
I like that.
and necessity are operators on those possibilities. And if you and you were speaking about the private stuff coming from the private into the public, and the W3C, since we're here at the W3C meeting, is of course an open forum where in the open standards are being made. And these standards, I think, it'd be interesting to work out, but a lot of these standards succeed, such as the semantic web, because they have mathematical backing. So if you look at the semantic web, it's an application of logic, including modal logic. If you look at the RDF1 spec, it mentions possible worlds. So it's interesting there that there's a mathematical necessity. You might even argue that there's a mathematical necessity at some of the core elements of the web itself. And then I was just going to go from that and perhaps open your now you're speaking about Facebook, right? Facebook is one way social networks can go. But another way that we're trying to work on is how can you build distributed, decentralized, open, secure social networks where everybody could have their information on their own servers. And actually then the interesting thing is, how would you deal with a lot of the problematic cases that Facebook is dealing with now in a system where actually you can't control the system anymore, right?
No, I mean, I do see that there are lots of we say dilemmatas in German, lots of dilemmatas involved. There's no doubt about it. But this point about that there are necessities in the design of the internet, I think Dave Clark would object to that. Very much so. That's the whole point of his article. He even mentions, I found that quite nice, he mentions someone who had developed a similar model to TCP/IP, a French guy, and he said he only failed because the French government really disliked it. Sort of French Telecom didn't like it. So he makes very political points, and he sort of treats technical arguments and political impacts on the same level. And
But the French didn't like it, I'm assuming, because they were stuck, they were going
In
down the
the
Minitel
telecom,
route.
yeah.
Right? So that is
Yeah.
very political.
So, but I would agree with your point that we don't have the same openness with all.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
Go on.
Sort of as the example I mentioned was gravity, law of gravity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So.
Or in network theory, it's giant attractors. And I think that the interesting, if you were designing the internet today, internet web, everything we know about, how would you do it, right? Can we retrofix it with re-decentralisation? And do these problems occur whatever you do? Right? These sort of social problems that occur on the internet, this is going to occur in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
Fundamental questions. Right. Dave, you were next, and then I'll give you the last question, okay? Because there's drinks waiting downstairs.
Okay, so I was interested to know whether you were aware, I mentioned it earlier about the WTSA conference that's coming to Tunisia in 2 weeks' time, which will lay out the basis for which the ITU, which is the UN Specialised Agency, will go forward for the next 4 years. And the proposals that are being put forward by Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and other countries are basically about reasserting sovereignty over what they perceive to be a new form of internet. I just back this up with direct quotes from the South African ICT policy document that says governments generally have limited influence on global internet governance issues and are thus not able to fulfill their responsibilities as custodians of public policy in their countries. It carries on and it says private sector business interests, predominantly based in the US, tend to dominate decision making, often silencing the voices of public policy advocates, including governments. Governments only play an advisory role. So I just want your thoughts.
I would say if you look at this, you will see that is a debate that tries to shift issues around. It's about control, who controls these issues. The government think control should be here. Certain governments think that. They haven't been very successful so far, have they? I mean, 2 or 3 years ago they tried the very same spiel and did not succeed. It's always the same governments, but the debate is interesting, that it always asks where should the control be? And that to me is a democratic debate. And there are different answers to that.
Yes. Manuel Castells would say that the power lies with the people who control communication. And in the future, you could have, there have been stories written about this, you could have, Facebook's bigger than many countries, so you could have the companies versus governments.
Yeah.
Very interesting juxtaposition, couldn't you? I'm not an expert on this, but it's so fascinating. Wow. Well, go on. Your last question, because then we can talk over drinks.
Sorry. It's all getting a bit comfortable for me. I just think that, while your position is really grounded in the notion of the dominance of Western liberal democracies, actually the world is very different from that. And where we're confronted with theocracies, where we're confronted with the notion of online tyranny being incredibly forceful, overwhelming and devastating in some cases, actually the image that you started with is precisely a perfect picture for your notion because it was in a newspaper. And I doubt now if that image had arrived on the internet, tomorrow, that it would have been allowed to be there. Because of the issues that you didn't highlight in that statement of Facebook terms of service, which is the notion of the possibility of feeling offence. And this issue is just such a fundamental issue at the moment that as long as I cry personal offence, there is nothing that you can do to challenge that. And that seems to be the point at which people retreat at every moment.
You mean you cannot do anything about Facebook taking down content?
No, I'm talking about the notion of the distinction between nudity as pornography and nudity as something else. So if you look at that first line of the statement, what Facebook don't use...
You mean this one here?
Yeah. So the issue is about limit the exposure of different people to using our platform to sensitive content.
Yeah.
What they don't talk about is the extent to which people take offence. And they deliberately don't do that because that's a language that everybody else uses. And that's a language that stops democratic interaction. It's a language that stops freedom of thought. It's a language that stops debate and is, you know, encroaching on the notion of freedom of academic debate in our universities. This is really crucial. Last question, sorry.
Oh.
It wasn't a question, yeah.
Are you reminded what I was thinking there was the cartoons of Mohammed?
Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
another
I'm
example.
not as
She's not.
optimistic as you are.
She's bringing
I-
up the fact that
I didn't find myself very optimistic towards the end. I actually tried to say it's modest what we ask for. I mean, what drives these debates is sort of prevent abuse, but there is not a sort of positive big vision that would people share at the moment. And I think probably that those using the internet are too diverse. There is not a sort of national community, but an international, very much international community. So I don't see us. I don't see us. Yeah. Gathering around common visions that would prevent this. It will be modest, but on the other hand, I do see new practices emerging, and how powerful they become, I'm not sure about.
we're all looking at the screen behind you. That's why we're all, because it's still there. With the see, they're in the system.
Yeah,
They're in
in
the
the system.
So, thank you, Jeanette, for that. Before we say a final thank you to Jeanette, though, I want to thank, is Laura out there?
No, I think they're downstairs, and I was going to ask you to do that downstairs.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Well, we don't want to do that.
Okay.
No, because everyone will start disappearing. Okay. I think we should thank you, and in absence, Laura and Sam, because they've done so much, and you have as well, for making this event possible. Thank you, Susan and everybody.